August 1942. The horizon over the Russian steppes carried not only the suffocating heat of summer, but the omen of an apocalypse of steel and gunpowder. After the failure before the walls of Moscow the previous year, Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht turned its war machine southward. The objective was clear: the oil fields of the Caucasus and an industrial city rising along the banks of the Volga River, a city that bore the name of the Soviet dictator himself, Stalingrad. For the German High Command, this was just another dot on the map, a strategic target meant to strangle the logistics of the Soviet Union. But for the soldier marching through the suffocating dust, Stalingrad would cease to be a city and become something else entirely, or in Caucasus, a cursed concept, the place where modern warfare lost its mind. What began as a brilliant offensive of armoured columns and air supremacy was about to transform into a human slaughter, unlike anything history had ever recorded. In this video, we'll witness how the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had brought Europe to its knees, collided head-on with a wall of rubble, blood, and fanatical determination. We are standing at the gates of hell, about to witness the most lethal urban combat ever recorded in human history. A place where a man's life wasn't measured in days, but in hours. Welcome to the beginning of the end. Welcome to Stalingrad. Part 1. The Caucasus Mirage and the March into the Abyss. To truly understand the catastrophe of Stalingrad, we need to step away from the front lines and place ourselves inside the Cold War rooms of the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified command headquarters buried deep in the forests of East Prussia. By early 1942, the Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable force that had rolled across the Polish border in September 1939. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, had failed in its primary objective, the total destruction of the Soviet state in a single lightning campaign. The winter of 1941, fought in the frozen hell outside Moscow, hadn't just seized the engines of Germany's panzer divisions, it had shattered the myth of German invincibility. Adolf Hitler, increasingly distrustful of his own generals, had taken direct personal command of ground operations. His diagnosis of the war was economic, obsessive, and, in his mind, ironclad. Germany could not win a war of attrition against the combined industrial power of the Anglo-American alliance and Stalin's seemingly inexhaustible manpower reserves without securing a single critical resource. Oil. If I do not get the oil of Maikop and Grozny, I will have to liquidate this war, he told his generals. It was not a metaphor, it was a confession of strategic desperation. From that obsession was born Directive 41, the operational blueprint for what became known as Fall Blau, Case Blue. The plan was a colossal pincer movement. Army Group A would drive south toward the peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, aiming to seize the oil fields of Baku. Meanwhile, Army Group B would push eastward toward the Volga River, establishing a defensive barrier and capturing the key industrial hub of Stalingrad. Together, the operation was designed to sever the Soviet Union's economic spine in a single stroke. At the center of this storm stood the German Sixth Army, without question the most powerful and prestigious single military formation in the Wehrmacht at that moment. A massive maneuver force of nearly 300,000 men supported by the 4th Panzer Army and Luftwaffe 4, the air fleet responsible for tactical air support across the entire southern sector. By any measure, it was a war machine of staggering capability. Commanding this force was General Friedrich Paulus. Paulus is one of the most tragic and psychologically complex figures in all of military history. He was not a mud-boots field general in the mould of Heinz Guderian or Erwin Rommel, men who led from the front and thrived in the chaos of battle. Paulus was a brilliant general staff officer, a logistician's logistician, a man who was most comfortable surrounded by charts, supply tables, and operational timelines, rather than the screaming chaos of the front line. He was aristocratic in bearing, deeply cultured, almost old-world elegant in his manners, but he carried a fatal flaw that would doom hundreds of thousands of men: blind obedience to Adolf Hitler. Paulus had never commanded an army of this size in direct combat. His meticulous, almost paralytic character, bordering on indecisiveness under pressure, would be tested in a war that had no use for manuals or elegant operational theory. And the test, when it came, would destroy him. On June 28, 1942, the offensive was unleashed. In the opening weeks, the world watching from the outside believed it was witnessing the final death blow to the Soviet Union. Across the vast, shimmering steppes stretching beyond the Don River, German panzer divisions moved with a lethal, almost balletic grace. The terrain, flat, dry, hard as a chessboard, allowed the Blitzkrieg to perform at peak efficiency. German soldiers, the Lanzer, marched under a scorching July sun coated in a fine layer of dust that worked its way into their lungs and the mechanisms of their rifles. Morale was sky high. Letters home spoke of final victory before the first snows fell. Soviet resistance appeared to crumble. Entire Red Army divisions were encircled and annihilated in smaller pockets across the steppe. But something was different this time. Unlike the catastrophic summer of 1941, the Soviets were learning. Under the guiding hand of General Friedrich Chuikov, Red Army forces began executing elastic retreats, deliberately avoiding the massive encirclements that had destroyed entire fronts the year before. They were trading space for time, falling back toward the last great natural obstacle standing between the Wehrmacht and the Ural. Mountains, the Volga River. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin was living through his darkest hours. The fall of Rostov-on-Don, the gateway to the Caucasus, was treated as an act of betrayal. Stalin understood with cold clarity that if Stalingrad fell, the Soviet Union would be cut in two. The Volga was the artery through which Lend-Lease supplies flowed up from Iran, and oil flowed north from the Caucasus fields. Without the Volga, Russia would starve and run dry. On July 28, 1942, Stalin issued the order that would transform the character of the entire war, Order 227, known to history by its brutal three-word motto, "Not one step back." There would be no more strategic retreats. Any officer who ordered a withdrawal without explicit authorization from above would be sent to penal battalions, Strafbats, to carry out suicide missions or executed on the spot. Behind the front lines, NKVD blocking detachments, units of secret police armed with machine guns, were positioned with explicit orders to shoot any Soviet soldier who attempted to flee from combat. Stalingrad ceased to be a tactical point on a military map. It became a question of existential survival for Soviet communism itself. As Paulus closed in on the Volga, Hitler committed an error that military historians still debate to this day. Drunk on his early successes, he divided his forces, diverting critical resources back and forth between Army Group A and Army Group B in fits of impatience, burning irreplaceable fuel on pointless lateral movements. Worse still, Hitler became personally fixated on the city's name. Stalingrad was no longer merely a target to cut Soviet river traffic. It had become a personal trophy, a propaganda prize he intended to rip from the hands of his arch-nemesis. Paulus, already suffering visible nervous tics from the strain of managing a logistical chain stretched to its absolute breaking point, watched helplessly as his supply lines extended thousands of kilometers across a barren, hostile steppe. Every litre of gasoline, every crate of 88mm shells, every loaf of bread had to travel a distance roughly equivalent to crossing the entire continental United States east to west. The Wehrmacht was approaching the outer limits of its operational elasticity. The climax of this march into the abyss arrived on August 23, 1942. It was the day modern warfare showed its most terrifying face. Luftwaffe 4, commanded by General Wolfram von Richthofen, a cousin of the legendary Red Baron of World War I, launched a massive aerial assault on the city. Over 600 bombers, Heinkel 111s, and Junkers Ju-87 Stukas conducted wave after relentless wave of attacks for hours on end. This was not a precision strategic bombing campaign. It was a campaign of psychological annihilation. Incendiary bombs turned the city's wooden residential buildings into funeral pyres. The petroleum storage tanks lining the banks of the Volga were struck directly, pouring rivers of liquid fire into the water below, creating the nightmarish, almost biblical illusion that the river itself was burning. More than 40,000 civilians died in that single day of bombing. The city, a modern industrial centre built in the bold, constructivist, architectural style of Soviet ambition, was reduced to a landscape of shattered brick and grotesquely twisted iron. That same night, panzers from the 16th Armoured Division reached the Volga itself at the northern suburb of Rynok. German soldiers stood at the riverbank staring at a city wrapped in fire and smoke, and believed the job was done. Hitler, in a state of euphoria, announced to the world that Stalingrad would be fully captured within days. What they did not know was that between the mountains of rubble and the choking smoke, thousands of Soviet soldiers and armed civilians were already emerging from the basements. The German bombardment had done the defenders an unintended favour. The streets were now blocked to tanks. Every ruin had become a machine gun nest. Every collapsed building was a natural fortress. Paulus and his 6th Army had just crossed the threshold. They were inside the gates of hell, and the rules of war they had always known were about to be incinerated forever. The stage was set for the Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats, where German technological superiority would drown in blood. Part 2, Rattenkrieg, the Iron Hell and the Geometry of Death. In the wake of the apocalyptic bombardment of August 23rd, General Friedrich Paulus and the German Oberkommando, the Army High Command, were convinced that Stalingrad was a ripe fruit ready to fall into their hands. On operational maps, the blue arrows of the Wehrmacht surrounded virtually the entire city. Intelligence reports spoke of a disorganized Soviet defense and masses of panicked civilians flooding across the Volga to the eastern bank. Then the 71st Infantry Division entered the city centre in September. Reality hit like a point-blank artillery shell. The Blitzkrieg, that precisely choreographed dance of tanks, dive bombers, and motorised infantry that had conquered Poland in 4 weeks, France in 6, and driven deep into the heart of Russia in a matter of months, died in the streets of Stalingrad. In its place was born the Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. German soldiers, trained and conditioned for sweeping manoeuvre warfare across open terrain, men accustomed to seeing the enemy at distances measured in kilometres, suddenly found themselves in a fight where the front line was not measured in kilometres but in metres, sometimes in nothing more than the width of a single brick wall. On the Soviet side, the arrival of General Vasily Chuikov to command the 62nd Army marked a pivotal psychological turning point. Chuikov was not a man of subtlety. He was a rough, broad-handed officer with a volcanic temper and the instincts of a street brawler. He had been on the outside of the Soviet system, serving as military attaché in China, and now he had been handed a poisoned chalice. Defend a city with his back literally against a river he could not cross without being shot. Chuikov analysed the battlefield and issued an order that would become the Wehrmacht's recurring nightmare. Hug the enemy. The tactic was elegantly brutal in its simplicity. Soviet defensive lines would be maintained at grenade-throwing distance from German positions, sometimes as close as 15 metres, barely 50 feet. This proximity neutralised the most fearsome weapons in the German arsenal. Stuka dive bombers couldn't bomb the Russians without near certain risk of massacring their own troops. Heavy artillery couldn't be brought to bear without the same result. Air-ground coordination, the very heartbeat of the Blitzkrieg, became almost entirely useless inside the city. Stalingrad became a pure infantry struggle, a contest of raw willpower where German steel met Soviet concrete, stubbornness, and the Soviets did not bend. One of the first showcases of this brutality was the grain elevator in the southern part of the city. This enormous reinforced concrete structure rose from the rubble like a medieval fortress. For days, a small group of Soviet naval infantrymen, coated in wheat dust and gunpowder, fighting in near-total darkness, defended the elevator floor by floor, level by level. The Germans threw frontal assaults at it supported by 88mm anti-tank guns, but the defenders moved through ventilation shafts and elevator gaps like ghosts, appearing where least expected. The smoke from burning grain created an acrid atmosphere that corroded eyes and scorched lungs. When the elevator finally fell after days of siege, the Germans were left in a state of stunned silence. They had been held up by 50 exhausted men. It was the moment the German command fully understood. Capturing Stalingrad was not going to be a victory parade. It was going to be surgery, performed without anesthesia. If the grain elevator was the symbol of initial resistance, Mamayev Kurgan became the epicenter of suffering. This hill, the highest point in the city, designated as Hill 102 on military maps, commanded a panoramic view of the Volga and the Soviet supply routes running along its eastern bank. For both sides, controlling the Kurgan was vital. Whoever held it could direct artillery fire across the entire city. Whoever lost it was blind. The battle for Hill 102 was so unrelenting that the hill's physical geography was permanently altered. Snow that fell in the winter months melted before hitting the ground from the constant heat of explosions. Military historians estimate that the soil of the hill contained between 500 and 1,000 metal fragments per square metre, more shrapnel per square foot than almost anywhere else on Earth during the war. Soldiers fought on the slopes among the decomposing remains of their own comrades because burying the dead was impossible under constant fire. The hill changed hands dozens of times. Taking the summit in the morning guaranteed nothing about being alive to see the sunset. The Rattenkrieg forced a brutal tactical evolution that neither side had trained for and neither side had fully anticipated. Combat went vertical. In a 4-story apartment building, Germans might control the second and third floors, while Soviet soldiers held the basement and the attic, fighting in opposite directions simultaneously in the same structure. Holes were blown through ceilings to drop grenades on the enemy below. Walls were dynamited to create interior passageways that allowed movement without exposing soldiers to the machine guns sweeping every street. In this environment, the weapon of choice was no longer the long-range German Mauser rifle. It was the Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun, a brutish, high cyclic weapon with a 71-round drum magazine perfectly designed for clearing rooms in short, devastating bursts. But the most feared tool in the tunnels and basements of Stalingrad was something far more primitive: the entrenching shovel. Sharpened to a razor's edge, the infantry shovel became the preferred weapon for silent close-quarters killing in the darkness. In the black silence of night, the sound of metal striking bone was often the only sound that preceded death in the corridors of Stalingrad. In the city centre, a 4-story apartment building overlooking a strategic open square became one of the most legendary symbols of resistance in the entire war. Pavlov's house. Sergeant Jacob Pavlov and a small multi-ethnic group of Soviet soldiers, Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Georgians, fortified the building with the methodical intensity of men who had no intention of ever leaving. They constructed an underground communications network connecting the building to nearby positions. They installed machine gun nests at every corner covering all approach angles. Snipers were positioned in the upper floors with clear fields of fire across the square. For 58 consecutive days, the Germans launched daily attacks with tanks and infantry. The defenders used anti-tank rifles to fire down through upper windows at the thinner top armour of approaching panzers, exploiting the one critical vulnerability of German tank design. No frontal assault from street level could penetrate the building's defences. According to Soviet accounts, on the operational maps of General Paulus's headquarters, Pavlov's house was marked with the symbol used for a full fortified strongpoint. The Soviets joked after the war, with the kind of grim humour that only survivors can summon, that the Germans lost more men trying to take that single apartment building than they lost conquering the entire city of Paris in 1940. Stalingrad was the paradise and the hell of the sniper. The infinite rubble field provided perfect concealment. Destroyed buildings became natural observation posts. Collapsed floors created natural firing positions. In this environment, individual marksmen became figures of near mythological status. Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev, a hunter from the Ural Mountains who had grown up stalking elk and bear in the Russian wilderness, became the most famous practitioner of the craft. Zaitsev didn't just kill German officers, he systematically dismantled the psychological coherence of entire German units. The fear of invisible death paralyzed troop movement. A soldier could not lean out of a window to observe the street, could not dart across an open gap between two sections of rubble, could not leave cover to find water without risking a 7.62mm round through the skull. The German command, reportedly desperate to neutralize the threat, allegedly dispatched their top sniper instructor, Major Erwin König, specifically to hunt Zaitsev down. The precise details and even the existence of this legendary duel remain disputed by serious historians, but the psychological impact of Soviet snipers on Wehrmacht morale was entirely real and thoroughly documented. They turned every street into an execution corridor. By October, the battle shifted north into the industrial district, and the proportions of the horror became industrial as well. The Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Barricadi cannon factory, and the Red October metallurgical plant were vast, cavernous complexes of reinforced concrete and structural steel. Built to produce the machinery of Soviet industrialization, they were now the machinery of Soviet slaughter. Inside these factory halls, the fighting was Dante's vision made real. T-34 tanks rolled off the assembly lines without paint, sometimes without gun sights, and were driven directly into combat by the factory workers themselves, ordinary labourers who'd been handed rifles hours before. They fired at point-blank range into German infantry that had already breached the outer walls and were fighting inside the production halls. The thunder of rifle fire, amplified and distorted by the vast steel superstructure of the buildings, created a sensory chaos so overwhelming that men lost their ability to reason, to communicate, to think clearly. Soldiers on both sides were driven to the edge of madness, and many crossed it. Throughout all of this, the 62nd Army of General Chuikov depended on a single thread of life: the Volga River. Every night, under direct German artillery fire, barges and small boats made the crossing from the eastern shore, loaded with fresh replacements, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Many were sunk before they reached the western bank. Thousands of young Soviet recruits died drowning in the freezing water or cut apart by machine gun fire before they ever set foot in the city they had been sent to save. The life expectancy of a newly arrived soldier on the western bank of the Volga was less than 24 hours, and yet the flow never stopped. Stalin and Zhukov were deliberately feeding the fire of Stalingrad with human flesh, keeping the Sixth Army completely consumed by urban combat, bleeding itself out metre by metre, while in absolute operational secrecy they prepared something far larger in the open steppes to the north and south. By late October 1942, Paulus controlled roughly 90% of the city. His forces had reached the Volga at multiple points, fragmenting the defenders into isolated pockets. His divisions were shadows of what they had been in June. They had taken catastrophic losses, were down to a fraction of their original combat strength, and were operating in temperatures that were rapidly plummeting towards Siberian levels. But from his Wolf's Lair headquarters, Hitler demanded one final push. What the Germans did not know, what none of them, not Paulus, not his staff, not the exhausted men inside the ruins understood, was that their time had run out. The air had already begun to bite with the cold of the Siberian autumn. The Volga was carrying the first drifting blocks of ice, while Paulus bled his army dry fighting over the last meters of rubble in the Barricadi factory complex. Hundreds of thousands of fresh Soviet troops and thousands of T-34 tanks were quietly massing on the German flanks defended not by elite Wehrmacht divisions, but by under-equipped, under-motivated Romanian and Hungarian armies that had never been designed to hold a major Soviet offensive. The Wehrmacht was trapped inside its own mirage of victory. The stage was set for Operation Uranus, and the fate of 300,000 German soldiers was about to be sealed in the greatest military encirclement in the history of warfare. The cauldron was about to close,